In an earlier video, I started an experiment to get a sourdough bread starter to a usable state in only 48 hours by using water that I'd infused with hawthorn flowers. My hope was that this would introduce some interesting and hopefully vigorous microorganisms into the culture, which would perhaps accelerate its development. It sort of worked. I was able to make something that definitely had some of the properties of a loaf of bread. I also ran a control batch, which I started with just ordinary flour and water. At the 2-day stage, that was also reasonably lively, but it didn't have that sourdough smell of the hawthorn flour starter. I only baked a loaf using the hawthorn starter, not the control. In hindsight, I wish I'd done both, but there's no way to unwind that. We can only go forward, not back. So, I kept both of those starters going, and this video is about what happened to them over the following week or two. It's now day 4 of this sourdough starter prep, and very interestingly, the standard sourdough starter appears to be pulling ahead of the hawthorn flour one, which I really didn't expect. I thought this one was going to be really lively, but it looks like this one's, I mean, they're both doing okay, but this one's got more bubbles and more foaminess to it. Mind you, this one did that earlier, so maybe this one's just catching up. Anyway, we're going to keep going. I'm going to feed these and keep on cycling them for about a week or so, and we'll see what we end up with. We're now about 6 days into this sourdough experiment, and that's my wild captured yeast. That's my control. Looking very different now. The control, which was just flour and water, has got a kind of crust on it and gone a little bit weird and fluffy. I'm going to ditch that crust and then feed it and rejuvenate it anyway. The one that was captured from the hawthorn flowers is actually looking really good. It's kind of foamy. And I think, if anything, this one's doing better than that one. And that's possibly because there was a greater diversity of organisms in there at the start than there would be in standard flour. So I've just fed those with a tablespoon of flour and a tablespoon of pure water. And I forgot to mention, they are actually quite different now. Apart from appearance, the flour-only one smells like beer. The hawthorn flour infused one smells like yogurty dough. So they are quite different, which is quite encouraging because that means we're going to get 2 different results, hopefully. We're now on day 8 of the sourdough experiment. So control on this side, which is just flour and water, it started with. Experiment on this side, which was hawthorn flowers and water and flour. I've just decanted both mixtures into a separate vessel so that I can wash out these jars. They're getting a bit crusty. I've put 2 tablespoons of flour and water in this cup and then 2 spoons of the mixture into there to feed it at the same time. And the same thing for the flour-based one. So 2 tablespoons of flour, 2 tablespoons of water, 2 tablespoons of the starter. And then that'll feed them up again. I'm going to discard this lot. I am tempted to kind of make a batch of bread today, but probably haven't got time. Anyway, so at day 8, there is still a difference between these two. So the flour one is definitely more lively and bubbly. And it smells sour and fruity almost. This one, it smells more yeasty, I would say. So more like the sludge that you would get at the bottom of a fermentation jar after making homemade wine, perhaps. Yeah, so sort of beery, winey smell to it. So I still think in terms of developing a sourdough, probably the one made from hawthorn flowers is ahead of the game. Both of these jars now have been washed and scrubbed and sterilised. I'm going to transfer these starters back into their jars, but I'm going to feed them again as I do it. So again, 2 tablespoons of flour in each one, 2 tablespoons of clean water, and by clean I mean this has just been boiled, and the purpose of that is to try to reduce any chlorine that might be in there. A lot of people mentioned that it's chloramine rather than chlorine that's in tap water, and that doesn't boil out so readily, but it still does boil out a little bit. So boiling the water, letting it stand, does actually reduce the chlorine. I'm not too worried about that because the flour will actually neutralise a lot of that. The purpose of boiling the water is really just to exclude any organisms that might be coming through in the tap water or might be living inside my taps. So the control batch, well, let's have another look at it. So this has had a couple of hours on that feed and it's kind of foamy, which is good. And the Hawthorn batch, not as foamy, I would say, at this point, but more bubbly. So I think they are both as lively as each other. There's a difference, slight difference in the kind of bubble size, but I don't know what that means. Anyway, starters are going to go back into their respective jars, so control goes in that one. And I am now bulking these up. So what I didn't do here is actually divide that. I've just fed it and I've ended up with more starter. And that's fine because that's what I want to do. And then the same thing with the Hawthorn batch. That's going to go into its jar. And I need to be careful because these could, at this point, with this much volume in these little jars, it could bubble over. So I'm going to keep an eye on them. What I haven't experienced with this is that thing where it separates and you get a wet layer on top. I haven't had that, but then I haven't covered it completely at all. And I must remember to make sure to use a new knife for the other one. I'll stir that in, just so we're not cross-contaminating the batches. So same thing there, we'll scrape most of that off of that spoon. Right, so we've still got control and experiment. The kitchen paper towels were getting a little bit tatty, so put a new piece on there. Okay, day 10. Let's have a look at these starters now. So the regular flour only one, really bubbly. Look at that. Okay. The flour and hawthorn juice one, not so bubbly. Slight disappointment, I suppose. But it is what it is. We're just going to carry on going. I don't even know at this point whether this one's catching up with something this one did earlier, because there was a point when this one was more bubbly a couple of days ago. So it might just be that this one's catching up with that. It might well be that we've got a better starter with just flour. Anyway, time to scale these up now, for which I've got some larger jars. So I'm going to put half a cup of flour in each of these jars with half a cup of water. So I'm going to carefully put, not so carefully. Okay, and half a cup in this one. Let's see if I can do that. Well, that wasn't any neater. Never mind. So, half a cup of flour in each jar. We'll also have half a cup of water. And then I'm going to transfer the whole of these starters into the mix. Still got to run this for a few more days, I think, before we go anywhere else. So let's just compare the smells again from the jars. So this is the control. Sort of winey, beery smell still. And this is the experiment, which is, yeah, a milder smell and kind of yogurty. And same as before, we'll leave them for 12 hours covered, and then we'll see what they're doing. It's now day 12. I think it's day 12. Honestly, I've lost track of which day it is, and I'm not going to go back and check the video timestamps. It's around about day 12, and it is the day of reckoning. I'm going to try to bake something with these sourdough starters today. Let's just take a look at them before I actually disturb them at all. So control on the left, experiment on the right, and you can see actually the control has risen more than the experiment, which is a bit of a disappointment, but it does actually look like the control batch is more bubbly and lively than the experiment batch. They're both doing okay. The control is actually more vigorous, which is not what I expected. It's not kind of what I hoped for either, but you know, there it is. We're going to go ahead and use these today. Let's have a look inside. So the experiment batch, it's still pretty foamy and bubbly in there. The control batch, very conspicuously yeasty and bubbly looking. Just lose that bit of paper. Right, let's have a sniff. Control batch. Oh, control batch kind of smells. I can smell esters in there, so it smells a bit kind of banana-like. And the experiment batch is kind of neutral, which is interesting. So it might well be that these need to evolve a little bit further. Anyway, what we're going to do today is two things. I'm going to use these to start some sourdough bread, but I'm also going to do what people often do with the discard from sourdough starters, which is make crumpets. So I've got a 1/3 of a cup measure, And I've already measured out 1/3 of a cup of flour into 2 separate cups. I'm going to have to wash this in between. But what I'm going to do now is give these a stir, and then I'm going to fill up this 1/3 of a cup measure. Interestingly, the experiment batch is quite a lot more liquid than the control. I don't know if that means it's metabolizing the flour more, or what it means, to be honest. So I'm going to take 1/3 of a cup here for starting crumpets. Okay, I will filter that level so we don't make a mess. So that's going to go into the cup with flour. I'm going to grab the same amount and put it aside for making bread, and then I'll feed these starters so that they are ready to go again. So we're not going to use them all up today, because obviously the point with a sourdough starter is you take some away from it and then you feed it and keep it going. So it's just under 1/3 of a cup there for that one. That goes in the empty glass, and we will use that for the bread. I'll keep that spoon in there. Now I'm going to wash this cup so I don't cross-contaminate. Okay, thoroughly washed cup. So just a little bit more stringy and gloopy than the experiment batch. Not a lot in it, but just stirred it to knock out the bubbles, so we are getting a similar amount of actual mixture. Okay, that's about 1/3 of a cup there. So that goes into the cup with flour. Same again for making bread. Going to wash the cup again because we'll feed these starters and then we can set them aside and just work with the reserved parts. So each of these is going to get 2 of these measures of flour. So 2/3 of a cup added to the starters to replenish them. They're also each going to get 2 of those measures of clean water. Give them a good stir, we'll cover them, and then these are done with for today. No point wasting those spoons and getting more spoons dirty. Those will go into the mixtures for making the crumpets. Some people said I should mark up the vessels with Sharpie markers or something like that so that I don't get them mixed up. I don't really think there's any need to do that. Control is on the left, experiment is on the right. I'm a full-grown adult man who knows his left and right. I don't think I'm going to make a mistake here. 1 cup of water, or 1/3 of a cup, one of my measuring cups. There is also already a pinch of salt in there, which I forgot to mention. When I measured the flour in there, I also put a pinch of salt in. I'm going to let those stand and let the lumps hydrate a little bit, and then we'll give them another stir. Control, experiment, we will set those aside over there. These 2, control and experiment, are going to be used to make batches of sourdough bread, which is going to take longer than the crumpets. So this is how it's going to work. I've got 250 grams of flour here, and I'm going to measure in 60% of that weight of water. First, good pinch of salt. All of my starter is going to go in there, so that's that 1/3 of a cup. Let's weigh that. So that's 32 grams, 33 grams of starter. There's 250 grams of flour in there. 60% of that is 150. So 150 grams of water. So I just pour that in until I get to the right point. There we go, tight, slightly over, but it'll be fine. And to start with, it looks like a disastrously wet dough, but it'll be fine. That's good, just going to let that stand for a bit. I'll do exactly the same with the other starter. Going to give both of these a knead, and I will wash my hands in between each batch. Back in a moment. But first, now these crumpet mixes have had a chance to sit a little bit, I'm just going to give them another stir to break up any lumps. In a moment we're going to cook these. Right, this is where it gets a bit exciting. So I've got my cast iron pan here, which I've very lightly greased. I've got 2 crumpet rings, or pochette rings, or whatever you want to call them, which I'm just going to also lightly oil the inside of. So we're going to get this pan warmed up to sort of medium heat. It mustn't be searing hot, or else all that will happen is the bottom of the thing will burn before the top has had a chance to develop. While we're waiting for that, small word of warning. Crumpets are like a thick pancake which has got lots of holes in the top. If you're a person who suffers from that condition called trypophobia, then you might not want to watch this bit, so I'll put a timestamp on the screen. If you're sensitive to that, then just skip ahead to this timestamp and you can avoid it. So the first batch which is the control batch. I'm going to hold down the ring while I pour in the batter. And I'm going to turn that right down now, so we're not really roasting it. So my experiment batch, which is always on the right, again, same deal, hold down the ring while I pour in the batter. Just really holding it down like that so that the batter doesn't escape under the edge of the ring. I'd say actually there's a little bit less in the experiment batch because it's stuck on the inside of the glass here, so let's just try to make it fair. Although I think some of that's because it hasn't risen as much, it's not as lively and bubbly. On both of these I'm starting to see bubbles rising to the top now and bursting, which is exactly what I'm hoping for. Crumpets need to do that. I think the batter might be a little bit tight for crumpets, so we may end up making something that's more of a hybrid between crumpets and muffins, but I'm sure that's going to be okay. So they're nearly done on the bottom now, and you can tell by just quickly lifting them up and burning your fingers. And yeah, they're not either as bubbly on the top as I'd hoped for, not really as bubbly as you'd expect from crumpets. That might be my fault. Crumpets aren't something I make very often because they're so cheap and easy to buy. I might have got the batter a little bit on the dry side. Or it might just be that this isn't lively enough or quick enough fermenting, or maybe I didn't prove it for long enough, who knows. All sorts of factors involved, but there we go. So these are done on the bottom now, and what I need to do is flip them over. So I'm just going to very carefully run a knife around the inside here. Ouch. And then quickly flip that over to cook the other side. And I'll just cook those on the other side for a further 5 to 10 minutes until they look kind of equally brown. Okay, so let's have a look. So that's experiment and control. The control does look a little bit like a crumpet, but I would say what we've got here is halfway between a crumpet and a muffin. They're going to be toasted some more anyway, so I'm going to stop there. Get these out onto a cooling rack now, and I'll let those cool down before we try to split them and toast them. I think I am going to have to split them because, yeah, even that's not really bubbly enough to be a crumpet. They're sinking a bit. I wonder if I didn't cook them enough. Right, these have cooled down a bit now. They are a bit doughy in the middle. I think I might have underbaked them. But anyway, we'll fork them, split them, and then toast them and see what we end up with. They're definitely not light enough to be crumpets. And we'll see what we got there. Yeah, too doughy on the inside, but never mind. Maybe the toasting will resolve that. And we'll do the same with the control. Interestingly, the control does seem to have baked a little bit better. So I think it's partly about the amount it rose as well as the amount I baked it. But yeah, I have underbaked these. Experiment control. We'll toast a couple of those. Right, they're not going to go any more golden than that. And this one's kind of curled up. I'll cook the other halves. We'll get some butter on those, and then we'll give them a taste. I don't think I have to stress that that's quite a disappointing result. Like I say, don't make crumpets very often. I think this might only be the second or third time I've done it. And obviously I haven't done it right. So do feel free to get down to the comments and tell me how I should have done it. Or maybe just say you did everything wrong, because that always helps. Right, control experiment. Let's taste the control first. I think I'll do this one because it's slightly better toasted. Tastes good. Just really nice bread flavour. Experiment. Yeah, definitely a little bit more of a sourdough flavour in the experiment batch rather than the control. A more gummy texture, but it didn't rise as well. Neither of these are great, but I'm going to be honest and say that between the two, the control batch is actually the tastier one. It's less gummy, it's a bit more bready tasting. This one's got an odd sourness to it, which is not exactly sourdough. It's almost like a bitterness to it. So the experiment batch has developed some interesting flavours, but they're not necessarily all that pleasant, which is interesting. Anyway, we're going to press on. We'll make the bread in a minute, and then I'll have another go at making crumpets later on, and maybe I'll get to redeem this recipe. Now that I've tasted them on their own, I am going to have a little bit of Marmite on them. Obviously that will completely confound any tasting results. So I'm going to stop now. So we're going to give this a knead now. This is the experiment batch. Any utensils that I don't have duplicates of, so like the spatula and the board, I will thoroughly wash and dry in between each batch. I actually think that cross-contamination is a bit of a moot point at this stage of the game, because the starter has inoculated this very significantly, and any tiny bits of contamination that got in there from the other batch would be overwhelmed by the stuff that's already there. That's a lot wetter than I thought it was going to be. So I will start with a bit more flour, just really so that I don't end up with it spread all over the board. As I knead it, it will start to come together, hopefully, and it won't. Yeah, here we go. So it's quite a loose dough. That's our control batch. That's going on the right hand side. Right, now this is the control batch. Well, interestingly, not as sticky as the experiment batch. So something in the experiment batch is doing something different to the flour. Perhaps digesting the gluten in it or something. I don't know. Obviously it won't be digesting all of the gluten, but it does seem like that's a more pliable and less sticky dough using the same proportions. And the only difference in there was the starter. That's the control batch. We'll cover that up as well. We've got both batches here. I will set them aside until I start to see them rise. Right, these have been proving for, I don't know, about 2.5 hours now. Let's have a look. So the dough's still quite sticky. It is springing back a little bit, so I think we're probably ready to knock this back, and then we'll get it into a tin and let it have its final rise in that tin. So I'm going to bake it in these little tins, and I've got more than enough dough for that. So I will divide off a portion. So we'll start with the control. This is just ordinary flour, it's not bread flour. Okay, so how much do I need for that tin? Too much there for certain. So let's weigh this. So I reckon maybe 2/3 of that, about there. Let's see what that weighs. 315 grams. Well, let's make it an even 300. I'll be quiet, Eva. Right, there we go. 301 grams, that's fine. So I'll set aside this portion of dough, and then we'll just knead this piece into a nice, neat ball. The thing is, when you work the dough like this and you tuck the ends in there, that's why I got those great big air pockets in there last time. But I don't mind that. I think that's fine. Okay, so that's the control. And now we'll do the same thing with the experiment batch. I would say, if anything, this dough has risen less than the control. I think I'm starting to get to the point now where I have to admit that the experiment is not having the results I desired. Kind of hoped that starting with those flours would give it a really interesting and lively sourdough culture. In reality, I think the control batch is actually turning out to be better than the experiment, but that's what experiments are for. Sometimes experimenting with a thing a different way only serves to confirm that you were doing it right all along. Kind of ain't broke, don't fix. We'll aim for 300 grams of this one too. I reckon about that much. Let's have a look. Too much. Still too much. Still a bit too much. 302. 301. Okay, exactly the same weight of dough there. Just give that another little knead into a ball and into the tray. So, control, experiment. Okay, those two test loaves now just need to be covered, and I'll leave them to prove. Okay, it's baking time, and that weird thrumming noise you can hear in the background is my oven coming up to temperature. And you can see, control, experiment, one of them has risen significantly more than the other, and it's not the one I hoped it was. So, anyway, I'm going to carry on. It is what it is. Just brushing it with plain water to help the crust to soften, which will give it the best chance of rising. But also that sort of loosens up any surface starches and helps the crust to form. This is the last time we will have any trouble distinguishing these loaves, so cut an X in that one for experiment. It's made a bit of a mess. And a big C in that one for control. And then those are going to go into the oven. I've got a big tray of water on the bottom shelf, These will go directly onto the railings on the second shelf. Well, there they are, baked. And surprisingly, what the experiment batch lacked in volume before baking, it has made up during baking. So this one sprung quite a lot more than the control did. They're both roughly the same size now. Interestingly, the control is a lot more brown on the surface than the experiment, and there's probably some sort of chemical reason for that. Something to do with which of these is metabolizing starches and sugars differently from the other. Perhaps somebody can let me know about that in the comments, but definitely these were on the same shelf in the oven. They should have baked the same if they were the same dough, so they're clearly not. The control has clearly browned a lot more than the experiment. Of the two, I would say actually the control is looking the nicer loaf. But anyway, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. These two loaves have been cooling for about 3/4 of an hour now. Both came out of the pan perfectly okay. Probably a little bit dense. It might just be that I'm not very good at making bread. So anyway, let's cut them open and see what they're like inside. So first, the control loaf. Nice crisp crust. Good open crumb inside. Lots of nice bubbles, different sizes. Looks alright. Nice springy sort of texture. And the hawthorn flour bread, same size slice. Slightly more moist inside, interestingly, even though the proportions of everything were the same, and a very different coloured crumb. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but this one's a sort of golden yellow colour. This one's kind of slightly greyish. Definitely a more grey colour than this one. How interesting. Let's have a sniff. Control batch just smells like really nice bread. The hawthorn flour batch, again, has less smell. I would say less bread aroma than this one. That's really interesting. There's some interesting sort of fruity, spicy aromas in the hawthorn batch. They're not present in the other one. Okay. A little bit of butter on each of these, and we'll give it a taste. I don't know if you can hear that. The texture of this crumb inside is actually quite moist. Not all that brilliant, I would say. This one's a drier crumb and just a bit more normal for what I would expect bread to look like inside, and the texture. So, I don't know. Well, anyway. Right, let's have a taste of the control batch. There's a really nice, almost maltiness to it. Really toasty, grainy flavours. And yes, just quite deep and rich, actually. So, the hawthorn flour batch. Strange. Yeah, there are some fruity, floury sort of aromas in there, really indistinct. Neither of them tastes particularly like sourdough, I've got to say. They're just kind of bread. Maybe I need to try fermenting the loaves longer before I bake. But, okay, conclusion time. I'm going to say of the two, whilst this has been a really interesting experiment, and I do think this hawthorn flour thing got off to a better start in a shorter time, over the course of the whole thing, I would say the regular control batch has actually ended up with a better result, which is interesting and slightly unexpected. I really hoped and thought we were going to discover some wild yeasts here that were going to give this a really distinctive and kind of unique flavour. In reality, I guess that has happened, but it's not such a good flavour and good texture as what we've got from just doing a regular sourdough starter. So these are the two starters now after I fed them and then left them alone all day again. And the control starter, you can see, is a more foamy, lively starter than the hawthorn flour one. And you can even see a difference in colour here. There's a greyish, bluish sort of tinge to this one, which is absent in this. This is a kind of beige colour. This is a kind of almost greenish blue tinge to it, which is interesting. I imagine that's probably the bacteria from those flours. And what else could we expect? We introduced wild bacteria and they're in there thriving. Okay, Studio Shrimp here with the conclusions. I suppose there are a couple of key questions to answer here. Firstly, what's the point of infusing the flours if the regular flour and water starter was better in the end? Well, for that one, I think it's a matter of you won't know unless you try. The flour-infused starter was definitely more lively and sourdough-like in its aroma at the very early stages, so I think it was still worth it for getting a slight sourdough taste in only 48 hours. I don't think the regular one would have been so tasty at the 2-day mark. I wish I'd baked a test loaf of both to prove that comparison, but what's done is done. On a different day, or maybe by just visiting a different tree, we might have ended up with a completely different result. Maybe some of those results could be better than the flour-only starter. Who knows? You won't know unless you try. The next question is probably, what happened to the hawthorn-based starter? To answer that, we just need to quickly remind ourselves what a sourdough culture actually is. Unlike bread yeast, which is often a monoculture of one specific strain of one species of yeast fungus organisms, sourdough is more like a community of different organisms, including potentially multiple different species or strains of yeasts, as well as multiple different types and species of bacteria, working both together and probably against each other. For example, the sour aroma and taste of sourdough usually comes from bacteria like lactobacillus, the same kind of bacteria used for culturing milk to make yogurt and some cheeses. During the development of a new sourdough starter culture, all of those organisms need to compete and find their places. Some of the things initially in there will probably go extinct as they are either outcompeted or consumed or poisoned by other things that are thriving. For example, that sour thing means acidity, and not all bacteria can live in acidic conditions. Over time, the surviving organisms reach a sort of equilibrium, and at that point the starter stops changing, and if it's good enough, it becomes the thing that you can feed, divide, and use to make consistently flavoured sourdough bread. Okay, and finally, what I think is the most interesting question of all, if the starter evolves towards equilibrium, how did I end up with two quite different starters? The answer, I think, is a phenomenon called local optimization. In a nutshell, the two starters couldn't arrive at the same place because they didn't start in the same place. By way of analogy, suppose you live in northern Italy and I'm here in the south of England. We chat online and agree that we're going to attempt to climb Mount Everest this afternoon. We both realise that Everest is a tall mountain, much higher than either of our current respective elevations, and after just a few moments' preparation, we both step out of our respective front doors on the adventure of a lifetime. Mount Everest is higher up than either of our current locations, so we both head uphill. Not very long after that, you arrive at the top of Mont Blanc. There's now nowhere else you can go that is up. All paths lead downhill. I also find myself with no uphill paths, but I didn't even get to the top of a mountain. I ended up at the top of a small hill at the end of my street. Neither of us got to Mount Everest. In fact, both of us ended up further away from Everest than where we started. Silly example, I know, but the point is we only had a really simple plan, consisting of go uphill. So we only achieved the local maximum, not the global one. But that's pretty much what living organisms do as they grow and develop. They generally don't have a complex strategy that has an abstract end goal in mind and a step-by-step plan for getting to that goal. Usually they just do something that confers an immediate advantage, i.e. grow, reproduce, move, consume. So in our two sourdough cultures, they started with a different set of organisms in them. The control was actually a fully contained subset of the experiment. All of the organisms in the control should also have been present in the experiment. But so were some other things, including different species of organisms, and also some possibly different nutrients and other compounds from the flowers at the very start. So as these two cultures changed, what was actually happening inside of there was all of the organisms, all respectively doing the next thing for them, each taking the next obvious, advantageous step, and all trying to go uphill one step at a time. And because they didn't start in the same place, they took a different uphill journey, and like the two people in my silly example, they ended up at different local optima, different peaks. Anyway, I hope this has been an interesting experiment. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.